Welcome to the PIDE webinar. My name is Nadib Haq. We are going to start our webinar. This is the first webinar after Eid, and I'm very happy to welcome Professor Helen Thompson, Professor of Political Economy in the University of Cambridge. Present, she has a great deal of expertise in the area of geography, geopolitics, political economy, and energy. She writes at the intersection of these three subjects, and she's written this great book called Disorder, Hard Times in the 21st Century, which is a great read because it pulls together the geopolitics of energy and looks to the future and talks about how energy has influenced us and how it's likely to influence us in the future. Professor Thompson obviously has written a lot and has been featured in almost every major business newspaper, from Financial Times, New York Times, to every other paper, Foreign Affairs Syndicate, Project Syndicate, etc. So I'm really keen to look forward to hear what Professor Thompson has to say. The systematic problem of energy is what she's going to talk about. But as I said, her book is very exciting. I really enjoyed it. And we should certainly like to hear what she's saying. Professor Thompson, as I told you, Pakistan Institute of Development Economics is an old think tank which deals with economics, as its name suggests, economic policy, public policy in Pakistan. And we have been trying very hard to keep up with what's happening in the rest of the world. And we look to people like you to keep us informed. So we're very grateful that you agreed to join us. And we are very really looking forward to hear what you have to say on this highly interesting topic. So with that, Professor Thompson, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nadim, for that very kind introduction. It's an absolute pleasure for me to talk to you all today. I've said things about Pakistan during the course of the last year in various talks that I've given in different countries about energy and what's been going on, particularly in the context of the war in Ukraine and the effect that has had on energy markets. And I'm very keen to see energy and talk to people about energy in global terms. Europe has had, in many ways, a pretty difficult year, but I think that it's easy in Europe to miss just how devastating the consequences not only of the energy situation, but the way European governments have responded to the energy situation over the last year have been for countries, not least for other countries, not least for Pakistan. So it really is a great pleasure for me to get the chance to talk to you and to engage with you on this subject. So my simple thesis, if you like, is that the world is in crisis, or that it more accurately faces multiple crises. What the historian Adam Tooze has frequently been calling the poly crisis. And in a way, I kind of accept that framing. What I want to stress, though, is that I think that energy predicaments are the systemic cause of the poly crises, and at least that they're a significant cause of a number of the significant crises that make up this multiple crises that we're going through. And in a way, I think that energy is, in some sense, the glue that holds the poly crisis together, if that's not mixing metaphors a bit too much. And I think there were several reasons for this. I'm just going to say something about briefly now, because it will come out more, I hope, in what I say. The first of them is the fact that we're going through an energy transition. The second of them is the fact that we're not just doing that for climate change reasons, but we're doing it because the fossil fuel energy regime that's been in place in the West anyway since the 18th century, in Britain's case, 19th century more generally, is, I think, in its own kind of crisis, independently of the ecological consequences of fossil fuel energy. Then we've got the war, and I think that that matters both because it involves the world's largest energy exporter, Russia, in a revisionist war, and because it has brought to the fore or added to the tensions around, perhaps would be a better way of putting it, a possible war that would involve the world's largest oil importer, China, in another revisionist war over at Taiwan. And in that sense, I think Ukraine and Taiwan are parallel crises. And then through all this, we've got finance and monetary questions. We've got the questions that are thrown up by the Eurodollar system, by the Federal Reserve Board's position as an international lender of last resort to the Eurodollar markets, and what happens to many countries when the dollar, many countries' financial, fiscal, monetary position when the dollar is strong. As we know, because Pakistan has experienced this in a way quite devastating form at the moment, when you have energy inflation, that means that the energy imports that you pay for are much more expensive, and you have that at a time of dollar strength, so that the energy costs of those imports in dollars is more expensive, then you have a pretty huge problem, and it's a problem that you can see actually in its structural form that was there in the 1980s too. So just to give you some sense of how I'm going to divide up what I want to say for the rest of the talk. First of all, I want to just say something about energy as an analytical category, and analytical issues around energy, perhaps would be a better way of putting that, in relation to both geopolitics and in relation to the macroeconomic world, and to suggest that when we take energy seriously, we think in different terms of different temporal junctures than we might otherwise do. Then I want to spend some time on the 1970s and the early 1980s, because I think that this is a really crucial temporal juncture for understanding the present energy disorder, because the present energy disorder that we're living through is, I think, the end of an energy interlude between that crisis, 70s going into the early 80s, and when energy came back as a significant problem in the middle of the 2000s. And it's that period from the middle of the early to middle of 2000s that I then want to concentrate on, and suggest that there are four structural forces that have been at work in shaping the energy disorder of the 21st century since then. And I'm going to conclude by saying something about why I think energy is here to stay as a source of disorder. So let's start with energy itself and think about this in terms of geopolitics. You can read a lot about international politics and in the international relations literature without finding that much that takes energy very seriously. And that, I think, is true regardless of whether one starts from a realist perspective on international relations, or whether one starts with a liberal perspective on international relations. So realists, you might think, would take energy pretty seriously because of the relationship of energy to military power. But actually, energy isn't particularly conceptualized within the realist paradigm, including missing the question of how a state might behave in relation to an energy security problem. So while realists take military security very seriously, they much less take seriously energy security. Liberalism, by contrast, treats economic interdependence as a crucial constraint on war, but I don't think most liberals take energy seriously as a specific energy problem, or think about the interdependencies between, I'm going to put that differently. I don't think that they take sufficiently seriously the asymmetries in the interdependencies between exporting states and importing states. Yet the fact is that we can explain a great deal empirically about the geopolitical history of the 20th century through the lens of energy. If we just take one big example, it will be the problem that the beginning of the age of oil poses for European states. The beginning of the 20th century is a European imperial dominated world. By second half of the 20th century, that is largely over. There were two big oil producing states at the beginning of the 20th century, the United States and Russia. And I don't think it's a coincidence at all that they were the two states that went on to dominate, particularly obviously the United States, the 20th century geopolitically. And European countries, only of whom Austria amongst the powers, great powers, had any oil whatsoever domestically, really struggled to exercise geopolitical power in the 20th century in anything like the way in which they did in the 19th. And indeed, they went down a terrible path of destructive wars, neither of which, the First World War, the Second World War, I think can be understood without oil. Now, I'm not going to get into that because it's not what I want to concentrate on, but I just want to establish here how I think oil is central to the geopolitical history of the 20th century. And if that was so, and the age of oil hasn't ended, we should expect oil to continue to be central to the geopolitics of the 21st century. Similarly, if we just take one other example from the 20th century, and I'm going to come back to this obviously from the 1970s, it's a big shift when the United States moves from being largely self-sufficient in oil, which it was until about 1970, to become the world's largest oil importer. That embroils the United States much more in the Middle East than it had ever been before. And it'd be impossible to try to understand American foreign policy from the 1970s onwards without understanding that American engagement with the Middle East. What then about energy as an analytical issue in terms of understanding macroeconomic issues? I think it's fair to say that most economists largely treat energy as just another economic factor subject to supply and demand. So if there's more demand, ultimately there'll be more supply, even if that substitution has to take place from one energy source to another. Conceptually, I would say most economists treat energy as subordinate to money. So the concepts of economics come from the money side of the economy and not from the energy side of the economy. Yet all economic activity requires the application of energy. And the use of energy is subject to the laws of physics, to which money have no relevance. And once we see how utterly economically transformative fossil fuel energy was in economic terms, so profoundly changing, or you might even profoundly changing the world, but put it more specifically, perhaps there is no notion of modern life, of modernity without fossil fuel energy. It becomes really odd that energy has such a peripheral place in much economic analysis. Having those separated out, money questions and energy questions, it's also clear once you start looking historically how the big monetary junctures that we think about have energy backdrops, whether that was the 1970s, the end of Bretton Woods, and I'm going to say something about that shortly, whether that be the 2008 crash, which was preceded by the highest oil prices that the world has ever known, whether that be the relationship between the shale oil boom in the United States in the 2010s and the extraordinarily easy monetary environment around quantitative easing and zero interest rates that came out of the 2008 crash. So we need to see the importance of energy, but we also need to think about the relationship between monetary politics, international monetary politics, and energy questions. So with all this in mind, how then should we read the 1970s and the early 1980s as the last period where I think most people who understood that we were living through, the world was living in some sense through an energy crisis, particularly clearly in the Western countries. The first thing to say about the 1970s is that there were a series of really sharp geopolitical shocks around energy. The first of them was to do with oil itself, and the fact that from the late 1960s, or from the middle of the 1960s, there was a fall in the rate of major oil discoveries that hasn't actually ever been. We're still on that trajectory now. The second was that the United States oil production pre-shale peaked in 1970. So if you look at a graph of American oil production, it's rising through the 20th century. It hits 1970 and it starts to come down, not on a completely straight line, for reasons we'll see in a moment, before we get to the shale boom. But from about 1970, the United States starts needing to import much more oil than it had previously done. And by the end of the decade, the United States had gone from being largely self-sufficient in oil to being the world's largest oil importer. If that was a shock that tied up with the United States, the next one was to do with European empire, and particularly the British position in the Middle East. So Britain had been the dominant European imperial power in the 20th century in the Middle East after the end of the Ottoman Empire, as we know. Britain had essentially acted, or tried to act, perhaps would be a better way of putting it, as the military guarantor of Western European countries' energy security in the Middle East in the post-Second World War period. But from 1967, it became clear, or in 1967, it became clear that Britain could no longer sustain the military commitments on which that depended. So the British withdrew from the Middle East, what's called the retreat from east of Suez. That happened formally in 1971. But the United States, which might then have been expected to replace Britain as a Western military power in the Middle East, not least since the United States itself was becoming now much more dependent on imported oil from the Middle East, wasn't either able or willing to do that against the backdrop of the ongoing Vietnam War. So what was now more clearly Western energy security in the Middle East depended upon non-Western powers, and particularly depended upon Saudi Arabia and Iran. They were the two states to which the Nixon administration hoped would protect Western oil interests, Western energy interests in the Middle East. But as we know, by the end of the decade, Iran had moved very firmly out of any kind of alliance with the United States as a result of the Iranian revolution. So by the end of that decade, we can see the Americans having to make some kind of military commitment from their point of view in the Middle East, what came to be known as the Carter Doctrine, where Carter said that a threat to, or the intervention of an external power in the Persian Gulf would be a direct threat to American national interests. In terms of the overall geopolitical picture here, tied to the departure of the British as the imperial power, I think we can say that in the same way in which the imperial military world that the Europeans had sort of set up in the Middle East in the first part of the 20th century ended in the 1970s, so, if you like, did its corporate equivalent, which was the dominance of 7 international oil companies, primarily American. So at the beginning of the decade, then the 7 sister oil companies, as they were called, dominated 90% of oil reserves outside the United States and the Soviet Union. By the end of the decade, most of those oil reserves were being controlled by states, the Arab states and Iran in particular. So the 70s was a decade of energy nationalism. It was a decade in which to be in the post-imperial world, as now the world clearly wasn't just to be free of European rule, but it was to control the national resources in your own territory. And we could see what was the way that could be used in geopolitical terms through what happened in the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, where the Arab members of OPEC imposed an embargo upon states supporting Israel and generally hugely increased prices in order with the explicit aim of imposing economic pain on Western countries. The final thing that I would say about the 1970s is that at the end of by the end of the decade, we could see the beginnings of a change that in the long term was going to have really considerable significance. And this was the economic reforms in China pursued by Deng Xiaoping. Because the energy shocks, or the oil price shocks, I should say, of the 1970s were experienced most intensely, obviously, in those countries with high per capita oil consumption. And that meant Western countries plus some oil producing countries like Saudi Arabia itself, where oil per capita oil consumption was high. So what was true about the 70s was that generally high capita per energy consumption was a Western affair. That was a product of the relationship between both European empire and energy in the 20th century and the relative self-sufficiency of the United States. But China's economic reforms were going to put in motion something that was already beginning to come out, and that was that world of Western dominated energy consumption was coming to an end with the industrializing Asian countries. Let's now have a think about the macroeconomic effects of the shocks of the 1970s. The first thing I want to bring out here is the way in which I think that it's not possible to understand why the Bretton Woods monetary system that had been in place since 1944 came to an end without understanding its relationship to the change in the energy regime. So Bretton Woods had been premised on a world economy in which the United States had a large trade surplus. But in a world in which the United States was going to import large quantities of oil, the United States was much more likely to have a structural trade deficit than a trade surplus. And it was going to need to be able to borrow from abroad in order to finance that deficit. So it's not, I think, at all surprising that within a couple of years of American oil production having peaked in 1970, that the Bretton Woods monetary system came to an end by an American decision, the decision to end dollar gold convertibility in 1971, really being, I know Bretton Woods lasted for a couple more years, but that being the crucial watershed moment. And then the fact that the United States under Nixon started what came to be called financial liberalization by removing capital control. So we begin to see a much more financialized world economy starting to come out of that crucial period between 1970 and 1973. And I don't think it can be separated from the fact that the United States was becoming such a large oil importer. Meanwhile, the oil price shocks, as we know, caused inflation. You have rising oil prices, you have inflation, and that went hand in hand with rising unemployment in a number of Western countries, led to that phenomenon that came to be called stagflation, of rising inflation and rising unemployment simultaneously. And the ways in which Western economies, Western governments responded to the complexity of the problems that put in play in a quite simplistic sense, or I'll rephrase that. The set of the set of policies that they pursued in the wake of the stagflation problem creates a world in which there's going to be much more debt, and that is made possible by the end of the Bretton Woods system. But just as importantly, if in Western countries we see a significant rise in household debt, in a way as a way of coping with the energy shocks, what we see in a number of commodity exporting countries in the global south is that what looks like the new advantages that they have in the post-imperial energy world, leading to them also accumulating significant more debt, this time state debt. So actually, what looks like a shift in the terms of trade in favor of commodity exporters in the 1970s leads in the end to what will be the developing country debt crisis that starts in 1982. Why then did that come about? How then did that come about? Again, we see an interaction between the monetary side, the monetary and debt side of things, and the energy side. Because from 1978, when Paul Volcker became chair of the American Federal Reserve Board, American monetary policy became directed at the inflation problem, in significant part the product of the energy shocks of the 1970s. So we have high American interest rates that lead to a much stronger dollar that makes the debt that the developing countries have accumulated in dollars more expensive to service. The high energy prices, or the stagflation in Western economies, particularly after the Iranian revolution, reduces the demand for commodities. So you have falling revenue at the same time as higher interest payments required on debt, and that leads on to that lost decade of development of the 1980s. But I think it's important to see that while this looks like a kind of set of interacting problems that could then perhaps have to be described as a polycrisis, in the ways in which crises in different parts of the economy the world economy are interacting with each other and then having political effects. From the point of view of the Western states, there does become a way out of the 70s, early 80s crisis. And that is because what the effect of high oil prices is that it makes it possible for oil companies to pursue otherwise prohibitively expensive offshore drilling. So actually, there starts from the early 1980s to be a significant increase of supply of the supply of oil into the world economy. And that means that high oil prices paradoxically ultimately bring oil prices down. And when oil prices come down, inflation comes down too. But it is important to note, to see that this was, sorry, I'll put this differently. The way out of the 70s crises around energy was possible for Western countries, but it didn't extend the same benefits to most developing countries, because they were trapped in the debt implications of what had happened in that term between the 1970s and the 1980s. And indeed, once, as a result of much more oil supply, then commodity prices were coming down, that made things even harder for the commodity exporting debtors. There was also a geopolitical effect of the way out of the 70s crisis from the point of view of Western states, because the new supply of oil that made the macroeconomic way out possible came not from anywhere in the Middle East or from the Soviet Union, but it came from Alaska in the United States, and it came from the North Sea, so particularly Norway and the United Kingdom. And the effect of that was to weaken the geopolitical power of OPEC, of the Arab oil producing states in particular. And when the price of oil then crashed from 1986, the impact went even further by making it incredibly difficult for the Soviet regime, now under the direction of Mikhail Gorbachev, to deal with its economic problems. So whilst it's not the case that oil price crash that began in 1986 was the reason why the Soviet regime collapsed, I think it's pretty clear that it is the reason why the collapse of the Soviet regime was swift, and that a set of dynamics were put in play that it was incredibly difficult for Gorbachev to deal with, including, I would suggest, once oil revenues had collapsed, being able to maintain the Soviet position in Afghanistan. And that, as we know, the demise of the Soviet Union brought the Cold War to an end, and that transformed the geopolitical environment across the world. Now, the consequence of seeing the 70s and the 80s in this way is that I think that we can see that whole narrative that was retrospectively put onto those 2 decades as a shift to neoliberalism is perhaps best thought of as a shift from a decade in the 70s in which resource constraints, particularly around energy, but not only around energy, were very much to the fore in politics in many places across the world, not just in Western countries, how that disappeared in Western countries. So if you go back to 1972, the Club of Rome published its famous limits to growth book. By the end of the 1980s, limits to growth is seen as having been completely wrong, being completely wrong, completely repudiated by events, and that it was possible to deal with problems, including energy problems, by applying market principles. I think, though, that it's important to see, in terms of understanding where we are now, or including understanding where we are now, that the limits to growth issue didn't just disappear. That there are some caveats that we should put in mind, we should bear in mind when we're thinking about this. One of them is to do with China, and that is that actually the Chinese leadership under Deng Xiaoping very much thought of economic development and population control as going together. So Deng Xiaoping's market reforms went hand in hand with China's one-child policy. So in China, there was a perspective that the issues of resources and population and development all were to be considered in the round. The second thing I would draw out is that the developing country debt crisis and the decade of lost development that ensued meant that non-Western energy consumption didn't grow as rapidly through the 1980s and 90s as might have been predicted from the as would have been predicted in the 1970s. So although limits to growth looked like it had been discredited, and there were reasons why the proponents of limits to growth had got quite a number of things wrong, that it didn't actually mean that the question of whether that there can be infinite growth on a finite planet and the place of energy in those questions had actually gone away. So let's now turn to the 2000s, because and I mean, when I say the 2000s, I mean the decade of the 2000s, because I think that there are several really important things that happened here that we need to understand to see where we are today. The first of them is that this is the decade where we can really see the effect of rising Asian energy consumption, and that it's driven by China in the first part of this century, particularly in the immediate years after China joined the World Trade Organization. India's oil consumption also grows quite rapidly at this time, but it's China's that's really quite spectacular. And this puts really significant pressure in itself on oil prices in the middle of that decade. The second thing that's true is that this is the decade that changes the international politics of climate change. And it does so again because of a significant change in one country's energy consumption. And again, the country is China. That China's dramatically rising coal consumption turns China in about 2006, I think it is, it's either 2005 or 2006, into the world's largest emitter of carbon. China hadn't seemed so important in the politics of international politics of climate change in the 1990s. That's absolutely not the case by the time that the climate summit in Copenhagen takes place in 2009. If we think of the 2000s as that decade as a China oil shock, we kind of think then see that from 2016, there's been a China gas shock. That China's demand for gas imports has grown quite significantly from 2016. It grew very dramatically in 2021. So the figures slightly vary, but somewhere between 15% and 19% increase in China's demand for liquid natural gas imports took place in 2021. And that created what I think is what exists now, which is a structural competition across Eurasia for liquid natural gas supply. And that crucially, that this intensified competition really began before Russia's war against Ukraine began. So we can see it pretty clearly in the autumn of 2021. European gas prices rise very sharply. Asian gas prices rise very sharply. The only reason I would say why there isn't a full-scale gas crisis that could have been understood in Europe as clearly as it was in China in the autumn of 2021 was because the Omicron variant of COVID came along and generally significantly reduced demand in the world economy. But this structural Eurasian competition for liquid natural gas was clearly in place 5 or 6 months before Russia's war began. Second big structural force at work in the 2000s is the stagnation of conventional oil production. So in 2005, if you look at data on oil production, that there was, I think there's actually a slight fall in 2005, but most importantly, that there is no increase going on 2005, 2006, 2007 in oil production, despite the fact that demand from Asia in general, China in particular, is growing as fast as it did. The reasons for that go back to the fact that there have been no large oil discoveries since the late really large oil discoveries since the late 1960s. So what we see in 2005, between 2005 and the middle of 2008, is that this rising Asian demand runs into stagnant supply production, and we see this incredibly big increase in the price of oil between 2007 and 2008. So world oil prices reached their highest ever level in the middle of 2008. When the world economy got going again after the 2008 crash, we see another period of high oil prices, 2011 to 2014. Prices are averaging over $100 a barrel pretty much all the time, or most of the time. That's the longest period of sustained oil prices that the world had seen. So it didn't take even that much recovery after the 2008 crash before we were back to this oil problem. But the remedy for this turned out to be the American shale oil boom. Now, there's several things that I want to say here. I don't think it can be underestimated what a big, well, I don't think it can be underestimated either the necessity of shale oil for the world economy to function in the way in which it did during the 2010s, or the disruptive consequences geopolitically of the American shale oil boom. It's also important to see that the reason why the shale oil boom was possible was because of the monetary environment that came out of 2008. American oil companies have known how to do shale extraction for a long time, but shale extraction is expensive. It needs a lot of credit. What the 2008 monetary environment created inadvertently was plenty of incentives for investors to pour their capital into the shale sector, regardless of whether oil production there was going to be profitable or not. So there became a quite dysfunctional relationship between the monetary environment, which needed to stay as it was, zero interest rates, quantitative easing after 2008 in order to sustain the shale oil boom, and what happened when the Federal Reserve Board wanted to try to normalize monetary policy to say that QE and zero interest rates were the exception and shouldn't be the norm. It's also the case that shale oil was incredibly geopolitically disruptive in the United States. Sorry, in the Middle East, of the United States' relationships in the Middle East, particularly with Saudi Arabia. When the Saudis crashed the oil price in 2014, one of the, if not the primary purpose of doing so, was to try to bankrupt American shale oil producers, because now there was a world in which, instead of there being two large oil producers, the United States, Saudi Arabia and Russia, there were three: Russia, the United States, and Saudi Arabia. And although the Saudis and the Russians had generally conflictual relations over oil matters, shale ultimately bound them together. Not initially, but by 2016, last months of 2016, the Russians and the Saudis come together to create OPEC plus as the oil cartel. Now, in the first years of OPEC plus, it kind of saved the Saudis from disaster because they couldn't cope with the low oil prices that they themselves precipitated. But there was still, OPEC plus was still working in a shale-dominated world. What we can see now is not that the American shale oil boom is over, but that it's slowed down, and that the American shale oil boom could not do the same kind of compensatory work in terms of providing oil to the world economy to compensate for the stagnation of conventional production that shale could do during the that could do during the 2010s. And this has mattered in terms of where we are in the post or in the world after Russia moved into invade Ukraine on the 24th of February last year, because in order to stop oil prices rising spectacularly as a consequence of the moves that European countries have put in place against Russia, against buying Russian exports, the United States under Joe Biden has had to make very significant releases of oil from the American Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And even then, probably last year, very high oil prices were only avoided by China also having a zero COVID policy for most of last year. So we're living in a world, oil-wise, in which conventional oil production remains stagnant, and that while shale boom saved the world from the worst consequences of that in the 2010s, it can no longer compensate in the same way. And yet the geopolitical fallout of the shale era of the 2010s, notably the emergence of OPEC Plus, remains in place now in ways that make things harder for the United States than they were in the 2010s. Third structural force of the 2000s is what happened in Russia. And what we can see in the early years of the 2000s is that as the oil price rose in the way in which it did on the back of Chinese demand and stagnant production elsewhere, Putin was able to use those revenues to recreate Russia as a great power. And Russia is not really like the Soviet Union was as an energy power. The Soviet Union had a clear vulnerability that played out in the 1980s. It was using export revenues from oil and gas in order to finance food imports. And it was when it wasn't able to finance those food imports that the regime imploded. But Putin's move to eliminate that dependency upon imported food, and indeed at some point after the Crimean crisis, Russia actually became a significant agricultural exporter, particularly in certain areas. And at the same time, Putin has wanted to use energy as a weapon, both in relation to the post-Soviet states like Ukraine, also in order to try to create dependencies of European states on Russian energy, such that Russia will have a relatively free hand in dealing with that post-Soviet space. Meanwhile, as in some sense Putin was trying to control European states this way, he was also taking advantage of the big growth in Asian energy markets. So the Soviet Union had been a European energy power, but Putin's Russia has become a Eurasian energy power, and those Asian markets have become ever more significant to it. Now, as we know, this got pretty significant consequences when it comes to what's happened in the last year or so as a result of the war, because what we've seen is a very significant disruption to Russia-Europe energy trade, but that hasn't replicated itself directly in terms of Russian-Asian energy trade. The United States can't tell China and India that they're not going to buy oil from Russia. So what we're seeing is a reconfiguration of the geography of oil trade. And the simplest way of understanding this, I think, is to say that European countries that had wanted to move away from the Middle East in terms of oil imports are being pushed back in that direction. Asian countries are being pulled in Russia's direction. I noticed that this month Pakistan had bought its first discounted Russian oil, but at the same time, it's pretty difficult to see why Asian countries, notably China, are going to want to make themselves too dependent upon Russian supply. So whether this kind of separation of oil markets in the way that I've just described is ultimately sustainable, I think that is very much open to question, because as far as the Chinese leadership's concerned, diversity of supply has long been crucial. And just because the Europeans don't want to buy Russian oil any longer, it doesn't mean that China is going to say, okay, we just adjust to that and concentrate on Russian imports. The other consequence of the war, as we all know, is that it hugely intensified this Eurasian structural competition for liquid natural gas, and Pakistan has probably been the big loser in that competition, and this is, as you all know, had devastating consequences, not least because gas has been is usually about 40% plus of the total energy mix in Pakistan. And what we can see for a country like Pakistan is the way in which the energy issue, the monetary issue, and debt and currency all interact with each other with like some lethal consequences. When you have energy inflation and debt and a falling currency and a need to import energy from abroad, you are left with, any state is left with very unpalatable options. And what's interesting is the way in which I think that some of the predicament that Pakistan is now in actually matches those problems that various developing countries had at the late 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s, including the way in which there becomes a political struggle between the debtor state and the international financial institutions when it comes to the conditionality of receiving credit. The final structural change that we've seen this century is obviously the energy transition and the attempt being made to decarbonize the world economy. Now, there's lots of things that might be said about this, but there's two that I want to pick out. The first of them is that pretty clearly the energy transition is itself a source of geopolitical tension. Now, this shouldn't surprise us, because if we go back to the 20th century, we see it in the way in which I was laying that out at the beginning, we can see how the introduction of oil into the energy world, the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, had profound geopolitical consequences. It was crucial to the United States becoming the most geopolitically powerful state in the 20th century. So if we have another energy transition, we should expect that to have profound geopolitical consequences too. And I think there is a not so implicit fear in Washington that the new energy age will belong to China, that China has advantages when it comes particularly to the manufacturing of the infrastructure and supply chains necessary for low carbon energy, and that China has had for some time a sense of strategic purpose around not only hanging on to those advantages, but extending them. And I think we can see the Inflation Reduction Act passed by the US Congress last summer in these terms. It's pretty explicit in its anti-China purposes. is that this is geopolitical competition about who is going to dominate the energy future, and it very much ties energy competition to technological competition that is going on in other areas too that aren't so directly about energy, like semiconductor chips. So although one might say that there are reasons why moving away from fossil fuel energy might alleviate some existing geopolitical tensions, we can't, I think that the new energy age will be missing geopolitical conflicts over resources, particularly metals. The second thing, though, that's true is we can already see, we saw this before the war, but I think it's become pretty clear, even clearer to even people who were skeptical about this before, that the energy transition is going to be long and it's going to be difficult. That China's turn away from coal pretty much stalled in 2017. Germany's been pushing an energy transition since the 90s, and it still has significant difficulties, even where it's made most progress, i.e. in decarbonising the electricity sector. Now, given that this is the case and that we still then live in a world where the predominant energy regime is a fossil fuel energy regime, we are going to be living not only in a multi-energy source world, but we're going to be living with the multiple conflicts, the multiple geopolitical tensions that these different energy sources yield. So if we just had an energy transition that was quick, we might think we were leaving the geopolitics of oil and gas behind, but we're not. We're going to have the geopolitics of oil, gas, and to some extent coal and nuclear power as well, plus the geopolitics of low carbon energy and metal extraction. And the tensions are going to interact with each other. So I should just give you like one example is, if we look at it in terms of low carbon energy, China has lots of advantages that the United States doesn't. It dominates metal supply chains. If we look at it in terms of oil, the United States has considerable advantages that China doesn't have, because it's got a much larger domestic supply of oil, and it is possible for the United States Navy to blockade China's the trade routes on which China depends. So just 5 quick thoughts to conclude is that I think that in part net zero, the energy transition itself, kind of became a way of trying to deal with the poly crisis, but actually because the energy transition is difficult and protracted, it is itself part of it. I think that Russia's war has really complicated the energy world, particularly its geopolitics, but actually the structural forces around the present energy crisis were all in place before the war. So it's not like the war created the energy crisis. The energy crisis is, I think, here to stay. It will change in form, but it is important to see the way in which the fossil fuel energy problems make the energy transition more difficult, because in order to do the energy transition, we need to use fossil fuel energy, and fossil fuel energy is becoming more expensive unless the world economy isn't growing very rapidly. In terms of the macroeconomic picture, we can see, I think, that the way in which governments have to respond to the political problems of energy actually make managing the macroeconomic policy more difficult. You can see that in terms of what happened in Britain during Liz Truss's short-lived premiership. She announced a huge package of support for households and businesses on energy, and then when her successor came in and had to try to stabilize the financial markets, quite a lot of that energy package was dismantled. And finally, I think that we are still going to live in a world in which resource conflict is geopolitically central to it. and the question of who gets to consume energy, what the distributional patterns of energy are, distributional conflicts about access to energy, both between countries and within countries, in terms of between rich and poor, are, I think, now a permanent part of politics.
Thank you very much, Professor Thompson. That's a wonderful overview of, I would say, global history over the last, say, couple of centuries. As I say, most economists have pointed out that really development or economic progress is really our ability to harness energy from 1800 onwards, and as the famous hockey stick graph shows. And you kind of unpacked that for us very well, along with the financial transition, along with the geopolitical transition, and so many other factors. I think it's really very, very interesting and very involved lecture. I personally couldn't take my ears off the screen, as they say. I was absolutely thrilled. Let me quickly, before I turn to the floor, raise a couple of questions myself. Listening to you, it seemed to me, if you substitute oil or resources for colonies, we're probably reenacting the First World War scenario, where Europe was kind of fighting for colonies, and we eventually landed ourselves into a world war. And it seems we're heading the same direction with the fossil fuel and energy. And this is despite the fact that almost all my life I've been hearing about how there would be an oil war, but yet we are hurtling towards it. And this is also despite the fact that we've set up a huge global paraphernalia of international agencies to help us, the UN system and the Bretton Woods system, to help us develop better collaboration in the world, and which has served us well for 70 years, but it seems that we've always been on the brink of something or the other and backed away from it. And this is also, again, at a time when climate change is really, really upon us. It's really on our heads. And we've been talking about climate change for 50 years now, and yet we are stuck on fossil fuels and we can't seem to price them at a level where we can deal with the climate issue. In fact, the trend has always been to try and find the cheapest possible price for fossil fuels, despite the climate disaster. So, I mean, how would you comment on that? But related to that also is the issue that the energy transition, yes, we're trying to make the transition from fossil fuels to renewables. But the one issue that kind of remains in the background, and lots of people have written about it and talked about it, is nuclear energy. Should we have gone much faster towards nuclear energy? Was that a solution? Should that be a solution? Why have we not taken that? So the politics seems to have taken over the whole energy issue, and the politics is really based on this narrow nationalistic kind of monopoly of resources and trying to cheat each other to get better handle on resources, whether America wants to go to war and destroy Iraq, Syria, or Libya for it. It doesn't matter. But somehow we can't seem to find those cooperative solutions that we so dream about. And we can't seem to find the solution where we can cleverly switch towards nuclear energy or some other. So the energy transition is not taking place as smoothly as it should have. How would you react to those two things?
Yeah, okay, let's start with the First World War and oil, and whether that is where we're heading again. I don't think it is where we're heading again, because I think that what is really, what's the way of putting this? Well, there's something really quite particular, I think, about what happens to the European states at the beginning of the 20th century. Is that they are, particularly obviously Britain, the most powerful states in the world, and they have empires. Britain is unfortunate from its point of view in that as it becomes clear that oil is really going to matter, not least for fueling navies, that nowhere really in its empire outside Burma has much oil. So empire doesn't actually help Britain initially in dealing with this problem. It doesn't help Germany at all. Germany's got less empire, obviously, and neither does it really help France. So you have states that are used to exercising power, that understand that the world has changed in ways that really, really disadvantage them, particularly in relation to the United States. But because they have empires, particularly the British, they can try to do something about it. So Britain, although it doesn't obviously imperially rule Persia, has sufficient sphere of influence in the south of Persia that it can get the oil concession there, and then oil is found in 1908. And then Germany has still sufficient influence over the Ottomans to think that it can be the power that will dominate. This is before the war in Mesopotamia. So if we think about the First World War in oil terms, what we have is a structural competition for oil among states that are really used to exercising imperial power, particularly Britain. They've got something huge, as they see it, to lose, and that they will use empire in order to try to secure oil resources. But I don't think that there's a parallel today in the same way of states that are both resource poor and have that kind of power. The United States is not. The United States is the dominant power in the world, and it's not resource poor. That really, I think, then raises a question of, well, could one imagine China embarking upon the kind of war for resources that emerged out of the First World War? And I think that's not been China's modus operandus for dealing with its resource problem. It's not that Chinese leadership don't understand the problems of foreign resource dependency, but they basically tried to use diplomacy, particularly economic diplomacy, paying for things. Now you can say that that's kind of neo-colonial, but it's not a war-based approach to the problem, and it's not acquiring a formal empire in the way in which the British came to do in the Middle East. On climate and the energy transition, I think that, in some sense, the tragedy here is that the need to act urgently for climate change is overwhelming, but changing the entire energy basis of modern civilization is incredibly difficult and inevitably going to be slow, not least because what we mean, leaving nuclear power aside, which I'll come back to, is what the energy transition means is moving from higher density energy to lower density energy. Energy transitions thus far, historically, have moved from lower density energy to higher density energy. Less so when you talk about adding gas to the mix, but gas didn't really replace oil except in electricity. So you just can't get low density energy to do the same kinds of things that high density energy can do. That's the laws of physics. So the urgent need that we have can't change the actual literal physical difficulties entailed in moving from one kind of energy regime to another. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't things that could have been done that would have speeded certain things up. But for instance, you can invest in as much solar and wind capacity as one likes, but at the moment, if the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, it doesn't generate you enough electricity, regardless of what capacity that you have. So, like in Britain, for example, I think that solar power produces at about 10% of its capacity because it's a pretty cloudy island on here. In terms of like nuclear power, I think that there has been a growing acceptance in many places, obviously not some, like Germany, that nuclear power will be part of the electricity mix going forward, and more so than people thought, like in the 2000s. But I think it's also important to see that the hope that nuclear power will be transformative is already history. We've already been there. That was the response, particularly in Europe, to the geopolitical problem geopolitical energy problems of the 1950s. So after the Suez Crisis in 1956, when President Eisenhower brought the Anglo-French military action to an end, and in West European capitals, prime ministers were all aghast that this could happen to them. One attraction was nuclear power, because you thought, okay, as we generate nuclear power, we're not dependent upon whether the Americans allow us to take military action in the Middle East or not. And then the hope was that nuclear power wouldn't just be used for electricity, but it actually would be a direct substitute for oil in transportation. You can find some almost utopian language about nuclear power from European politicians in the 1950s. But it turns out that nuclear power is incredibly capital intensive. A lot of money has to be spent in order to make it safe. And from a European point of view, it doesn't solve your foreign resource dependency problem, because you still got to import the uranium from somewhere. So I think we have to be pragmatic about nuclear power. It is likely to be part of the energy mix, for electricity generating mix, for a good number of countries, and some that have retreated from nuclear power will go back in that direction. I think that's really what's happening in Britain, but it's not going to be a panacea. I think that the history of nuclear power has already demonstrated that.
Thanks. Okay, let's take a few questions. Amir Durrani.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Saab, and thank you very much, Helen. That was like a riveting lecture, and I actually have not been attending Nadeem's lectures for a long time, so that in itself speaks volumes for the fact that I'm very interested in the subject that you talked about. I think let me ask you, let me first give you 4 or 5 things, the thoughts that came to my mind, and then maybe you can construct or help me construct a future. And the reason I'm asking these questions is because Dr. Nadeem, for example, is sitting in like the NBER of Pakistan, Institute of Development Economics, and supposedly he guides at a public level the whole discourse around our economics, of which energy, as you have so aptly demonstrated, is a pivotal part. Now, may I just go on to extend that in the future, the way I look at it, multilateralism, energy, the extraction, and the transition, all 4 things. Now, I'll explain multilateralism because, as you know, you very rightly pointed out the transition is next to impossible to a particular source. And that also, so what is happening? Where I think the world politics, especially the poor getting poorer, that's my point of view, the South getting further deeper in shit, is essentially partly because of the fact that this whole transition, the cost of going from, as you said, from high density, low density to high density, and now going backwards is really, really high. Why is it high? It's also high because of the choices in front of us. Who has the technology for the transition? You see, that's the really part of the equation people are not talking about. It's nice to tell me to buy electric cars. It's nice for telling, but all that technology generation, whether it's wind, whether it's tidal. I mean, Ireland produces a lot of tidal, and so does Norway. They're investing heavily. But look at us. I mean, we are already. So just taking Pakistan as an example, I would actually say, well, let's pollute and become another China until, we have the money and the resources to clean ourselves. And I often give the examples of my 1977 and earlier visits to London and the subsequent London that I have visited. But, when you have money, you clean it up. You clean up the Thames, you move the port outside, you do all those things. And now you're telling me that I can't pollute the 11-kilometer channel, which obviously was a gift from the British aristocracy to Pakistan. But my question, therefore, to you is, number one, why is there no focus on the solutions? Because really the solution lies in the demand management. In other words, why do people still ask households and commercial users to not switch to a single point source of energy? In other words, in my mind as an engineer and a latter sort of student of economics, is that, it's much easier to move electrons than any form of dense energy, right? So if the user decides that, then we really have three sectors: the transport, as you very rightly said, the agriculture, and the manufacturing, which are really, they drive everything, right? So if we are somehow able to let them do what they do, but make sure the households and the commercial users are not for heating, cooling, cooking, all the what we call the structure of demand of energy, they are not looking for multiple sources. So that's number one. Why is that? There's no thrust on that, especially for countries like Pakistan. The second question, and the second last, is that in this move that you talked about, technology, the technology in the transition, because we just finished an energy transition study for Pakistan, which was followed by the one done in India. The World Bank is trying to harmonize the GHG emission calculation. And the question there is that, has anyone thought of this technology end? I mean, will this technology be given to us free? Will the manufacturing bases come to us free in the South or in the developing world? Because if not, then, to hell with it. There is no economics, whether on financial or economic terms, that can allow me to really argue for transition locally. Because, you can tell me that Pakistan can be impacted, we can keep ourselves clean, but we neighbor China, and you just explained it's the biggest polluter in the world, right? Right there, smack on top of us. And the last question is on the nuclear. I think you have very, very rightly said that, nuclear is going to be a personal choice. And, it would be nice to see in some future lecture from you the impact of nuclear, given that half the known reserves are in, again, the Eurasian continent. Kazakhstan, where I used to live, has half of it, and that's why they are so-called the chair of the nuclear bank. What would that look like? Because you outrightly rejected the fact that, it's not going to be the fossil oil story, as you explained very rightly, from 19th to 20th to 21st century. So I'm sorry about this long question, but thank you so much.
That's great. Okay, I think I'm going to try to answer your first question, perhaps quite generally, before getting to the more specific point. I mean, I entirely agree with what you're saying in terms of the chasm between the language in which Western politicians talk and the realities for a country like Pakistan. And I think that there is just a huge political problem when basically you have Western politicians who have economies that are entirely embedded in the fossil fuel energy regime, and then are trying to do the energy transition, telling developing countries that without being embedded in the fossil fuel energy regime in anything like the same way, that you're just going to jump into the new energy world. Because essentially what the Western countries are doing, they've got this huge hedge against the difficulties of the new energy world, which is that they are dominant in the fossil fuel energy world, and they're not going to give it up until the energy transition goes more rapidly. And I don't think Western politicians have begun to get to grips with what kind of political problem that is. And I think this question then of whether part of the way forward through these deep difficulties isn't going to have to be demand management for energy in its different forms is going to be yes in the end. I mean, and what we're seeing, I think what we see really clearly with the competition for liquid natural gas supply, it is the richest states use their advantages to procure the supply regardless of the consequences for the poorer states. They don't ask their citizens to make adjustments to using energy in their household if that they can use the advantage of being rich and being able to pay more for liquid natural gas imports to pay for them. And I think that at a certain point there is going to be blowback from the energy consumption problems that essentially European countries in particular over the last year have dumped onto other countries. they're going to have to have to face that, and what that means for how they themselves use energy. I mean, on technology has to be part of the answer, because the whole energy transition is premised on technological innovation. The profound difficulty is that those technological innovation haven't happened yet. That net zero is, in that sense, a bet on future technological success that nobody right now can have any idea about when that success might come about, or whether indeed it will come about. So before we even get onto the question of who gets access to the technology, some crucial things need to change technologically for the energy transition to happen in anything like the way in which governments talk about, starting with solving the problems of electricity storage. And if they are then solved, if there is a breakthrough, technological breakthrough, that allows the storage of electricity generated by solar and wind, it will be incredibly important who then has access to that technology, and that it isn't simply something that where poorer countries are essentially expected to fend for themselves. Because if that's the case, then the energy transition for them simply can't happen. I think the question of nuclear power and resources and resource competition is very interesting. And one of the things I think is most striking about the reaction of the United States and European Union and Britain to Russia during the course of last year is that various sanctions were, on the energy side, were put in place, starting with coal, moving to oil. There weren't actually sanctions on gas. That was essentially European countries having less Russian gas, because Russia embargoed the sale of it de facto to European countries. But the one area where things have stayed as they were is uranium, nuclear power, including the sale of uranium. If nuclear power is going to grow, then Russia's resources still very much matter for the world. So I mean, Kazakhstan, as you say, is obviously very important too, but the geopolitically really difficult thing here is Russia's importance on the nuclear side.
Dr. Mahmood Khalid, can you please ask a question?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Helen, for a very inspiring lecture. Honestly, as Amir has just mentioned, my quick question is related to the energy insecurity or the geopolitical tensions, which facilitates blocks creations or even transition. Does it really expedite that transition? Does the world think about these insecurities going long, or do they think that they can cover their positions by creating blocks or something like that? This is my first question. Second is that, what is your opinion about the changes which happen within a country in response to these energy insecurities, be it the Jair Bolsonaro's Brazil's indigenous people demands for not coming into the territory and protecting it, whereas they're pressing it to open up for drilling and other sorts of activities, or be it the Biden administration allowing the willow drilling project in Alaska. How does the internal country's politics or the way things are being managed also is influenced by this energy insecurity? So the first is with relation to that, does the world take it as a threat or some issue for which they have to take long positions, or they try to cover it by creating blocks? And second is related to the internal chemistry of a country. How does it change? Thank you.
Good questions. I mean, I think on how governments think about the energy security, I think that there's a lot of simply short-term improvisation. And I think if you could see that quite clearly, even in China, which is probably the country whose leadership has thought most systematically about energy security for multiple decades now, but particularly in the 21st century, there was a moment in autumn of 2021 when China was rationing electricity to industry, where the message went out, basically get energy from wherever by whatever means possible. And I think that could have served as a mantra for gas for many European countries, particularly Germany, during the course of the last year. I think that the countries that are particularly dependent upon foreign energy imports do try to, at the same time, engage like long term. And I think that what's notable, though, is how hard they find that to do, like on a cooperative basis. So even the European Union, where there is formally an energy union between the member states, if you look at the energy mixes of different member states, they're really quite radically different from each other. Even states that are in other ways quite similar. So, for instance, Germany and France, or Poland and Hungary, or Poland and Czech Republic might be a better example now. So this isn't really going to be something that they can think about long-term energy security on the same basis, because they just start from such different places. And I think that reflects the fact of how hard energy politics is in terms of both procuring supply at times, but also trying to find a pathway to change. So I think if we try and think of it as a problem of like international then cooperation, one of the reasons why it's so difficult isn't just because it's a resource competition, but because the histories of different states in relation to that history of resource competition through the 20th century has yielded such like different outcomes. So it's incredibly difficult, I think, for there really to be a common European Union energy strategy, because the starting places of its members are really quite different. I entirely agree with you about the importance of understanding the internal politics, particularly of resource extraction within a country. I think that we can see that metal nationalism is probably on the rise in the politics of a number of Latin American countries, including Chile, around lithium. I think we can see in the United States that there's a profound internal division between citizens who really don't want resource extraction of any kind to happen in the United States for environmental reasons, and the corporations who know that there are profits to be made out of the United States quite rich mineral resource endowment. And I think that quite a bit of politics in the United States over the next decade or so will be caught up around this question of who wins that political contest. I think, though, what's striking when you bring the European countries into it is that it's clear that there's a deep aversion of the majority of citizens in European countries to resource extraction at home. But that's a profound problem, because even leaving aside the fact that most European countries aren't particularly materially well endowed in this respect, European citizens can't expect to continue with their high per capita energy consumption and then say, well, we want the resource extraction that's necessary for that to take place in other parts of the world. Particularly, they can't say, we want it to take place in those parts of the world that were once subject to European imperial rule. And at the same time, as we've already said, be telling the same countries' citizens that they shouldn't be building an oil pipeline because don't they know that fossil fuel energy regime is coming to an end. So I think that this unwillingness in European countries for citizens to see that resource extraction is an essential part of their way of life, and not wanting it to happen where they actually live their lives, is going to become a really serious political issue.
Thank you. Well, I mean, it seems the question that comes to my mind still is that despite all our progress, we still remain very resource competitive. And despite trying to seek cooperative solutions in many areas, we can't seem to find any cooperation in resource extraction. We all know that we need all these resources. We need fossil fuel, we need other resources. Now we need many more chemicals and complex chemicals such as lithium, etc., that are coming up. We are also beginning to make some, nanomaterials that might replace some of these things. But on balance, geopolitics does not allow us to develop a cooperative solution at all. In conclusion, could you give us some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a good part of the history of the 20th century. And if you look at the relationship between the United States and Europe, I think that this is a good example, because you have a lot of talk about shared values, commitment to a liberal international order, importance of like multilateral institutions. But look at the actual history of relations between European states and the United States during the course of the 20th century. Before 1945, after 1945, you find astonishingly little like cooperation. And indeed, at certain points, the United States has been willing to take some very direct action to stop European governments doing the kind of things that they want to do in order to improve their energy security, whether that be the Suez Crisis in 1956, whether that be extraterritorial sanctions against European companies that were involved in building the Trans-Siberian pipeline in the 1980s, whether that be the sanction regime against Iran at the moment. You can see very clearly the hierarchy in the supposed Western alliance when you look at energy questions. And that's before we even get to the question of cooperating between states where energy per capita energy consumption is high, and states where per capita energy consumption is low. Having said all that, is that I think that given how much the energy transition depends upon metal extraction, is if we can't find some way collectively of creating some kind of like structures of cooperation, or if not cooperation, at least rules that lessen the competition, then we're going to go down a pretty disastrous road. So, if you want to think in terms of recreating some kind of, maybe it's even creating some kind of multilateralism in the world, then you would start, and you're being serious about it, you would start with energy, because energy is the thing that's got the greatest, or resources, let's say, because its resources have got the greatest capacity to be divisive in this respect.
Thank you very much, Professor Thompson. It's been wonderful. As Amir said, he summed it up. It's been a riveting talk. We've enjoyed it enormously. And inshallah, it'll be put up on YouTube and lots of people will be watching it. I personally am going to ask every student at PIDE and every student in Pakistan to watch it, because you really pulled together the history of energy and also the history of development and link all those structural issues so well that it should be compulsory in most of our universities. And we will make your book a required reading on our reading list. We have a reading list that we update every few weeks, and we will put your book on that, because I think, again, it's a masterful, endeavor to summarize history from the point of view of energy, and it'll be wonderful to have students read that. So thank you very much, and we'll hopefully keep in touch with you and keep you coming back to us and giving us more of your research. Thank you.
I would very much like that. Thank you very much.